this is Munson from Munson Music, and welcome to Talking with the Guitar. And in this particular episode, we're going to talk about some things called octaves and octave shapes. And what octaves are is oct means 8, and if you counted up 8 letter names like on your fingers, and whatever note you start on counts as 1. So we'd have A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then A. So if you went from an A note to another A note, that's something called an octave. So it's the distance from one note to another note with the same name. And actually, since last time we were talking about the E string and counting off and measuring off scales and chords on one string, this episode we're going to kind of talk about where all those E notes are. And then we'll take those shapes and we're going to kind of move those around ad nauseum, perhaps, for all the other root notes that we have. So for instance, if we started with just E notes on the guitar to try and find all the E notes, it kind of relates back to something we talked about before called chromatic scale, which is where you kind of organize the notes sharps up, flats down on one string and don't skip anybody. So just to review that really quick on the E string, you'd have E and F sharp and G sharp and A sharp and B and C sharp and D sharp and E. And then if you come back down the E string, you have E and E flat and D flat and C and B flat and A flat and G flat and F and E. And what we're also talking about is measuring things off, so kind of thinking about the string in relationship to scales with 1, flat 2, 2, flat 3, 3, 4, flat 5, 5, flat 6, 6, flat 7, 7 root shapes. Or if you're working them down, you can kind of think those same things. Or in relationship to chords, where we were kind of thinking about the 2s as 9s, and so we'd have 1 and then flat 9, 9, and then we'd have flat 3, 3, and then the 4 could be an 11, the sharp 4 could be a flat 5, the 5 is 5, but then 5 could have a sharp 5 or a flat 6, and then we got a 6 and then a flat 7 and a 7 and then back to 1. But what's really important to know is like where the 1 is, or where the root note is, or where the tonic note is, where everything's kind of relating to it. So one way to get used to that is doing some things I call note finds, where you kind of take a note, pick any note, and just go and use chromatic scale to find that note on every string. So for instance, on the E string, the E is open. However, you could also play it on 12th fret on that same string, and that's another E note. So we got an E to a 12th fret on the low E for a E shape. It's kind of on one string for an octave. But then if we go to the A string, we have A sharp, B, C sharp, D sharp, and E's on 7th fret on the A string. Which also means if you ever add 12 frets to that, then we'd actually have another E. So if we took 7 and added 12, we'd have 19. So if you went to the 19th fret, that would be another E note on the A string. So you could do it on 7, or you could do it all the way up on 19. And then on the D string, you'd have D and D sharp and E. So we'd have an E on 2nd fret on the D string. But you could add 12 frets and make that 14th fret on the D string. And then on the G string, you've got G sharp, A sharp, B, C sharp, D sharp, and the 9th fret is another E note. So if we added 12 frets to 9, well, that's 17, no, it's 12, no, it's plus 9, I can only count to 4. But, so if you went all the way up on your guitar, all the way up to 19th fret, and then you'd have another E note. And then on the B string, you've got B, C sharp, D sharp, and E's on 5th fret on the B string. So you added 12 frets to 5, then that's 17. One of my favorite numbers. So if you went to 17th fret on the B string, that's another E note. And then on the open E, you've got open E, which is open. And then you've got 12th fret on the high E, which is another one. And if you added another 12 frets, if you have a 24 fret guitar, you could actually go up to another set of double dots all the way up on the top. But that would be a very, very nice guitar that you have. So we basically have an E open. We got 7 or 12 on the low E, 7 on the A, 7 or a 2nd on the D, 14 on the D. And then we have an E note on 9th fret on the G string, 5th fret on the B string, or 17th fret, depending on how you want to go. And then you've got open E and then back to 12th fret on the E. Well, there's some really cool shapes, like as we're kind of going up the guitar, that those notes are kind of making. So there's this really cool pattern of shapes that happens on the guitar. And so if you played the open E, and then we'd have 2nd fret on the D string, then we could kind of go to open E. That would be one little section of kind of our octave shapes for E. And then actually that B string note that we're playing on the 5th fret is actually the same exact note as the open E, and sometimes that gets used for tuning. So you've got 5th on the B is kind of the same as first finger and kind of went to the A string, or B string on the 5th fret, and then went to the 7th fret on the A string, then that would be the next shape, kind of the octaves. So you'd have 5th fret on the B, the 7th fret on the A, and then if you put your first finger on the 7th fret on the A, then you can kind of work it to the 9th fret on the G, and then from the G string on the 9th fret, you could kind of put your first finger there to kind of go to the high E on the 12, or the low E on the 12, and that would kind of be another octave shape, or octave shapes. And then from there, if you go from the low E to the D string on the 14, or low E12 to D string 14, that's another octave shape. And if we go from the 14 on the D to the 12th fret on the high E, that's another octave shape. And if we go from 14 on the D to the B string on the 17, then that's another octave shape. And we have some shapes that are now repeating, because 14 to 17 is the same shape as 2nd to 5th on the D and the B strings. And then from the B string on 17, you could go to the A string 19. And then from the A string 19, then you could go to the G string on the 21. And we have a lot of shapes that are kind of repeating. So the main thing is getting used to like what those shapes look like. Because if you ever move by that distance on the guitar, you're going to end up playing another note with exactly the same name. So it can be really cool to know those E's as kind of landmarks. And some of those shapes, actually, I kind of have this pet thing called baseball octaves, where if you took the low E string on the 12th fret, and then went to the D string on the 14, and then went to the high E on the 12, and then kind of went from the 12th on the high E to the G string on the 9, and then from the G string 9 to the low E string on the 12, that's kind of looking like a baseball diamond to me. So I think about kind of working that particular area, which knocks out 4 of your octave shapes, as kind of a home bass being the low E string, and D string on the 14 being first bass, and then high E on the 12 being second bass, and then high E12 second bass to the G string on the 9th fret is third bass, and then kind of going back to home bass on the low E12. So you can kind of, otherwise it's all E's, right? Now some people would talk about what string they are. So you'd have low E to the D string to the high E to the G string to the low E. I'm thinking home bass, first bass, second bass to third to home, kind of run around the basses. And then from there, actually, the octave shape that we end up with, actually from the B string to the A string, where we had B string to the A string 7, I kind of think of that as left field and right field. So the way to get there, this is kind of the weird part, but going high on this, you could go low E on 12 to D string on the 14 is kind of home to first. And if you take your first finger and go to the D string on the 14th fret, and take your pinky and go to the B string on the 17, I think of that B string 17 is what I call left field. And then if you put your first finger on left field and kind of go to the A string on the 19, or this could be 5th fret on the B string to 7th fret on the A string, I think of the A string note as kind of right field. So that keeps left field to the left of right field, the way you're looking at it. And then if you take your first finger and put them on the A7, and then I kind of work that shape to the G string on the 9 to kind of get back from the right field to the third bass. And then from there you're back into your diamond again. So that can be really cool to just know those E notes like the back of your hand, so you never have to think about it again. And if you're thinking shapes, that makes it really easy to find other notes, because as long as you're moving by an octave shape, you're always going to another note with the same name. So if you know the E's really well, it can make it really easy to kind of take that idea and then move it around. So for instance, instead of looking for E notes, if we were looking for F notes, then we could go low E on the first fret would be an F note. And if we move that same shape from home bass to first bass to the D on the 3rd fret, then those are both F notes now. And then from there, we could go from the D string 3rd to the high E 1st fret, and kind of have 2 more F notes. And then if we went from the D string, kind of thinking first bass to second bass, so now I got home bass on the low E first, third bass or second bass or first bass on the D string 3rd, and then second bass on the high E on the 1st fret. That's kind of my first octave shape. And then from there, you could go from the D on the 3rd fret to the B string on the 6th fret, and that would be another F. So this is first bass to left field. And then you put your first finger on the B string 6 as left field, then A string on the 8th fret is kind of your right field. And then from the A string 8 to the G string on the 10 is kind of your right field to third bass. E on the 13 or the high E on the 13, and that's kind of your home bass and second bass again. And then from there you're back into the diamond, kind of for your F notes. So you got F to F, F to F, F to F, F to F, and then from there you got 13th on the low E to 15 on the D string, and then 15 on the D string to 15, 17, 18 on the B string, and then 18 on the B string to 20th fret on the A string, and then from 20th fret on the A string you could go to 22nd fret on the G string, which would be ridiculously high. So you may want to take those shapes and then try and kind of find all the F notes using those same shapes. So every time I'm moving by that shape, it's always an F. And then you could take that and move it over one more fret, and then we would have an F sharp octaves. So then we'd have home bass on the low E 2nd fret, D string on the 4th fret, and then 2nd fret on the high E string for our F sharp notes. And then if we go D string on the 4 to the B string on the 7, then that's your next F sharp. And then B string on the 7 to the A string on the 9 is the next F sharp, it's left field, right field. And then if we put first finger on the A string on the 9, then we go to 13th fret or 11th fret on the G string, that's an F sharp note. And then if we go from 11 on the G string back to the low E or the high E on the 14th fret, then that's our F sharp notes there. And then we got home bass to kind of back to first bass on the D string on the 16th fret. And then we have D string to the high E on the 14th, or we could go to the B string on the 19th fret, or we could go B string on the 19th to 21 on the A string, and that would still be F sharps. So we're just taking those shapes and moving them over one fret each time. So if we went to G notes, then we'd have low E on the 3rd, D string on the 5th, high E on the 3rd, and then open G would kind of be your first G notes. And then from there we have home bass to first bass, low E 3rd to D string on the 5th, and then first finger on the D 5th to the B string on the A, kind of for your next G notes. And then we have B string on the 8 to the A string on the 10 as your next G notes. And then we have A string on the 10 to the G string on the 12, and then everything's kind of starting over again. So then our 12th fret on the G to the low E on the 15 is like open to 3rd. And then we got high E on the 15 is kind of your second bass. And then we got home bass on the low E 15 to D string on the 17 to high E on the 15. And then D string on the 17 to the B string on the 20, and then B string on the 20 to the A string on the 22 would also be G notes. So then we could take that idea and move it for G sharps. So then we could do G sharp on the low E on the 4th fret, and then D string is going to be on the D string on the 6th fret, and then high E4 is another G sharp, and then first fret on the G string is another G sharp. And then low E on the 4 is kind of where we started, so that's our home bass. And then we got low E4 to the D string on the 6, it's kind of our home bass first bass. And then we got D string on the 6 to the B string on the 9 is kind of our next G sharps. And then if we go high E or a B string on the 9 to the A string on the 11, then that's our next G sharps. And then if we go from the A string on the 11 to the G string on the 13, then that's our next G sharps. And then if we go G string on the 13 to the low E on the 16 to the high E on the 16, that's our next G sharps. And if we go low E on the 16 to our D string on the 18th fret, then that's our next G sharps. And then we could work it to the high E 16, and then from the 18 on the D to the 21st on the B string would be our next ones. And then we can move it over to A's. So we can go low E on the 5th fret, the 3rd fret or 7th fret on the D string for our A notes, and then high E on the 5th is an A note, and then 2nd fret on the G string is an A note, and then low E on the 5th is an A note, and then low E on the 5th to the D string 7, and then D string 7 to the B string on the 10, and then B string on the 10 to the A string on the 12, and then A string on the 12 to the G on the 14, and then 14 on the G to the high E on the 17 and low E on the 17. And then low E on the 17 to the D 19, and then D on the 19 to the 22nd on the B string. And then we could go over for A sharp notes. So we'd have A sharp on the low E string on the 6th fret. And then we could actually add in the 1st fret on the A string for this too, actually. And then you could go G string on the 3rd, would kind of be your left or right field to 3rd bass, A sharps. And then you have from the 3rd fret on the string on the 11th fret to the A string on the 13th fret is your next B flats or your A sharps. And then from the A string on the 13 to the G string on the 15 is your next A sharps. And then from the G string on the 15 to the high E on the 18th fret is your next A sharps. And then from the low E on the 17, 18 to the D string on the 20th fret would kind of be your next A sharps. And then, if I only had one more fret. And then from there we can move it over for B notes. So then we have B on the low E on the 7th fret. Or we could do open B, kind of to the 2nd fret on the A string. Or we could go A string on the 2nd to the G string on the 4. Or we could go G string on the 4 to the low E on the 7 or the high E on the 7. Or we could go from the low E on the 7 to the D string on the 9. Or we could go from the D string 9 to the B on the 12. Or we could go from the B12 to the A on the 14th fret. Or we could go to the A from the 14 to the G on the 16th fret. Or from there, let's see, 16, 17, 18, 19th fret on the E's. Or from the 19, we could go all the way to 19, 21 on the D string. And then from there, we could go to C notes. So then we could try all our C notes. And we could even start this back on 1st fret on the B string. And then go to the A string 3rd. So we got C notes there. And then we got 3rd fret on the A to the G string on the 5th. And then we got G string on the 5th to low E on the 8th for C notes. And we got high E on the 8th. And then from home bass on the low E 8 to the D string on the 10. It's kind of C notes. And then we got D string 10 to the B on the 13th fret on the B string. It's kind of C notes. And then we got 13 on the B to the A string on the 15. And then we got A string on the 15 to 17 on the G. And then we got 17 on the G to 18, 20 on the E's again. And if you're lucky like me and have 22 frets, then you can go from the C on the low E to the 22nd fret on the D string, and that would be a C note. And then from there we can do C sharp notes. So then we got low E on the 9's a C sharp note. Or we can start way back on B string on the 2nd fret, and then go A string on the 4th fret. And then we got A string 4 to the G string 6. And then we got G string 6 to the high E on the 9, or the low E on the 9 for C sharp notes, or D flats, depending on which way you want to look at it. And then from the C sharp on the low E, then we'd be going to the D string on the 11th fret. And then from the C sharp on the D string 11th fret to the B on the 14th fret, C sharp notes. And then from the B string 14, we'd be A string 16. And then from the A string 16, we'd be going to the 18 on the G string. And then from the 18 on the G string, we'd be going to 21st fret on the E's again for our C sharp notes. Got a little my intonation up there. So then from the C sharp, we could go over to D, and we're almost there. We only got 2 more notes left. So if we go to the D, we can even start open D, and then we could go B string on the 3rd is kind of another D note. And then we'd have A string on the 5th fret, kind of left field, right field shapes there. And then from the A string 5th to the G string 7 is another D, the D. And then from the D on the G string, we could go to the high E on the 10, or low E on the 10 for our next D notes. Kind of 2nd bass, 3rd bass, and then home bass there. And then you got low E on the 10 to the D string on the 12. And then we got D string on the 12 to the B string on the 15. And then we got B string on the 15 to the A string on the 17. And then we got A string on the 17 to 19 on the G. And then if you get really crazy, you could go all the 22 on the E's again to kind of start it over again. If you're looking like me. And then from the D, then we'd be going to a D sharp, and we can move those shapes around for D sharp. And we could even start back on the D string 1st fret, would kind of be a D sharp, to the B string on the 4th fret, would be a D sharp or an E flat, depending on which way you want to see it. And then from the 4th fret on the B, we could go to the A on the 6th. And then from the A on the 6th, then we'd be going to the G on the 8. And then from the G on the 8, we'd be going to the high E on the 11, or the low E on the 11. And then from the low E on the 11, we'd be going D on the 13. And then from the D on the 13, we'd be going to the B on the 16th fret. And then from the 16th fret on the B, we'd be going to the A string on the 18th fret. And then on the A string 18 for D flats, or E flat, or D sharps or E flats, we'd be going to the G string on the 20th fret, kind of for an E flat note. So that's kind of another E flat. And then from there, we'd be going back to E. So we're kind of back to our E notes that we started on, and we've come come full circle and played every single note on the entire guitar, which is awesome. So the main thing there is just to kind of get used to that shape, because if you know the octave shape really well, it makes it a lot easier to kind of attach shapes to it, to kind of work it into talking with it. And octaves are also one of the strongest shapes, actually, of all time. If you have a melody line that you really want to reinforce, playing it with octaves or playing octaves in a solo actually can sound really good.